Hi, this is Dennis with Pathmaker. Welcome back. Following our trend of the two types of videos that we produce, which are discipleship videos as well as videos that teach on the warnings where Jesus had told his disciples to be very careful of some of the bad teaching that's out there. That was applying towards the Sadducees and the Pharisees and the scribes and basically the religious leaders of Jesus' day. Well, that still happens today. And so Jesus said he was giving the disciples a warning, and these videos are basically the same thing, trying to warn fellow Christians, be very careful because there's some really bad teaching out there, and it could be leading you astray from the real meaning of being a follower of Christ. Today we're covering a controversial subject of the end times, and how does it apply, or how does globalism, how is that attached or involved with the end times? And we're going to cover that in a little bit. But some of you may have heard of key terms like Revelation or the apocalypse. Many kind of throw those words around when it comes to the end times, but don't really have a clear picture of what they really mean. And on most occasions, these words either tend to cause fear, or sometimes it draws out people that just maybe don't know a lot about it, and they're very hyper spiritual, in a hyper spiritual panic. They basically blurt out things that aren't actually true. And, that, really leads to baseless assumptions, and we want to be very careful of that. So what I want to cover today is, what does the Bible have to say, about end times and globalism and these things that, that people speak of, but maybe not necessarily understand what the scriptures say. So, we're going to cover that today. So, a lot of times when it comes to the end time discussions, it involves Jesus somehow. What do we know about Christ? I mean, we do know that, he was a historical figure. I mean, just looking at what the Old Testament said about Jesus arriving here on earth, it said that he would be born of a virgin in a small town called Bethlehem. Now, the odds of that happening, the predictions of what the Old Testament said, are just astronomical. I mean, there's just no way you can count the odds of that happening, but it did happen. And, many historical writers wrote about Jesus outside of what we know from the Bible. So we do know he was a figure, and it involves Jesus. We do know that, and, there was a number of predictions in the Old Testament, over 300 of them, about Jesus, coming to earth. And I find it interesting that now that Jesus has ascended, there is over 900, 3 times the amount of predictions in the Bible of Jesus' return. So a lot of times when you put that together with Jesus' return and the end times, it can actually cause either interest or panic. Are you doing what's right in the eyes of the Lord? And it's almost like, okay, am I right with the Lord? And do I fully understand what's involved in his return? But to really understand, all these predictions of Jesus' return, over 900 of them, there's 2 key Bible verses I really want to share with you, or get you to understand that these actually 2 Bible chapters that are very important for you to understand the end times. Those 2 chapters are found in Daniel chapter 2, where the prophet Daniel describes this dream to Nebuchadnezzar. And the other Bible chapter that's very important for you to understand the end times is Matthew chapter 24. And Matthew chapter 24 actually is the words from Jesus himself. So I think those 2 key areas of the Bible are very important. One's found in the Old Testament, Daniel chapter 2, one in the New Testament, Matthew chapter 24. And in these chapters, we'll find not only what they said in the past, but what Jesus said himself. Hey, these are things that you need to understand about my return. So keep those two in mind, and we're going to kind of use those two chapters as key for our study today. So here are three things to remember when it comes to the understanding of what the Bible says about the end times. The first thing to remember is that, Jesus spent time here on this earth and then ascended to heaven. Now, the time after Jesus had ascended to today is considered the end times. There's a lot of debates out there on, when the end times are, and, people try to nail down a date, and, not a really good thing to do. Just, a simple understanding that any time after Jesus' ascension is considered the end times. So the second thing to understand that's very important is the interpretation of Nebuchadnezzar's dream in Daniel chapter 2. Now, if you are a Bible reader, it's very important for you to understand that, especially somebody that's wanting to understand eschatology, the study of these end times, and what the scriptures say. It's important to read what it says, and in Daniel, we find in chapter 2, Daniel is basically confronted, with the fact that him and a lot of fellow prophets or fellow believers in God are basically going to come to a point of execution. And the reason for the execution is that Nebuchadnezzar, who is the Babylonian king at the time, wants his people to interpret his dream. And so in this dream, Daniel reveals actually the world empires and what will happen throughout history. So it's real important to understand Daniel chapter 2 and that dream. So it's important to read it and understand, and we're going to go over some of that in a minute. Now, the third thing to understand when it comes to understanding the end times is understanding the season. When Jesus said there's going to be this season, and it's really important that you look at these world events that are going on in specific areas of the world, and you'll know it's a season. It's a time of near when he's coming soon. And I want to be very careful of that because, a lot of people have tried to predict Jesus' return, specific dates, and boy, were they ridiculously wrong. So, I don't want you to think I'm going to give you a date or anything here. I'm just going to, kind of go over what the scriptures say and what Jesus says. So, so remember those three things. The time after Jesus is from that period of his leaving the earth to now is considered the end times. The interpretation of Nebuchadnezzar's dream that Daniel, the prophet Daniel, interprets, it talks about the world empires, before the world comes to an end. And then that third thing is understanding that Jesus talked about a season, and that season prior to his return. And we'll go over that in a moment. Okay, so covering some of the things that have basically happened over the past 2,000 years when it comes to predictions, where we have someone come out and say, hey, God is going to do this, or the end times are going to happen, or the rapture is going to happen during this certain date, where they were ridiculously wrong. In some of those accounts, it's almost kind of sad and embarrassing for these people, but Jesus warned of this. Hey, there's going to be people that will come, and they'll come in Jesus' name, and they'll make these false predictions. So, here's a few of them. Back in 1524, there was a guy by the name of Johannes Stoffler. He was a respected German mathematician, astrologer, and his problem is he predicted a great flood would happen and it would cover the world, kind of like what the Bible says with the Noah's Ark. And he said that, hey, this is going to happen on this certain date. This is kind of like God's thing. He's going to allow this flood to happen on the earth. And we're talking February 25th, 1524. He predicted it. It never happened, obviously. So, and here's a guy that was very well respected, a mathematician, somebody known in the community for his work in the science community, and sadly, he was wrong. It happened again in the 17th century. In 1666, many Christians were fooled by this. They had thought, wow, 1666, it has the three numbers of 666 in it, and so that's got to be the time when the world ends. So, sadly, a lot of them were predicting that the world would end in 1666. Of course, that date came and went, and nothing happened. So, another, unfortunate prediction by somebody who just, by folks that just kind of predicted something, and without reading your scriptures, this is going to happen. People are going to predict stuff that aren't true. And then again, there was a lady by the name of Joanna Southcott, and she was actually from here in the U.S. And in 1813, or actually 1799, she claimed, hey, there's going to be a bunch of famines. There was going to be a bunch of problems in the world, and a lot of people were looking to this lady. In 1799, she had like over 100,000 followers. That's even pretty big today in today's standards. If you have 100,000 followers, on some media platform, she had it in that day, and people actually believed her and thought, hey, these famines are going to happen, and there may be a time when the world is going to end, or the time of the end of the earth will happen during this date. Of course, that date came and went. Nothing happened. And then later, ridiculously, she predicted that in 1813, she said there would be a second Messiah, and she would be the mother of this child. And a lot of people almost just it got ridiculous because they were like, "Hey, you're like over 60 years old. Your first prediction was wrong, and here we are again." So another bad prediction. In 1843, there was a preacher by the name of Miller. And this is another guy who had over 100,000 followers. And he claimed that, in 1843, there would be a rapture, and all of his followers. And he had, again, another guy with over 100,000 followers. And this is basically his writings, people coming to listen to him. This preacher, William Miller, predicted that the rapture would happen, that they would all be caught up, to be with the Lord, as what it says in the scriptures. So sadly, this preacher, William Miller, because the rapture didn't happen in 1843, he said, oh, I made a mistake. It's going to happen the following year in 1844. And once again, ridiculous, it didn't happen. So, that was in the 1800s. What about, recently? I kind of think of what had happened in 1999, and many predicted Y2K, and the world would end because of the financial system would collapse because the clocks on computers couldn't count to 2000. I mean, it was really ridiculous. But and then of course to compound the problem, we had a song by a artist formerly known as Prince, who had this song called 1999, and everyone's thinking, the end of the world is going to happen. And sure enough, obviously, nothing happened. So that was more of a recent, occurrence. And it happened in 92 as well. Someone else, I can't remember who it was, but in 1992, there was predictions of the rapture happening in October 28th. The rapture is going to happen in 92. And obviously it didn't happen. So 92, 99, and then soon after that, we had, in 2011, we had people saying that Christ was going to return again. And then in 2012, one of the biggest hoaxes were, the Mayan calendar. Everyone said, hey, the world is going to end because the Mayan calendar says that's it. That's going to be the end. So I point out all of these, predictions that didn't happen because it's ridiculous. And I think if people just read the Bible or read their scriptures, it's so easy to find out what the scriptures say. I think they would have run across Matthew 24. Now, Matthew 24, 23 through 26, and I'll read it with you. It says, Someone may say, here is the Messiah, or there he is, but don't believe it. False messiahs and false prophets will come and work great miracles and signs. They will even try to fool God's chosen ones. But I have warned you ahead of time. If you are told that the Messiah is out in the desert, don't go there. And if you are told that he is in some secret place, don't believe it. Because there are going to be a lot of people that are going to try and predict, because I think a lot of it comes down to them wanting attention. Look how holy I am, or look how knowledgeable I am, or look how important I am because I can give you this date. And people, maybe they're hopeless and they want to, kind of jump on a bandwagon, and they follow somebody that's a false, predictor. So, Jesus warned of that. Matthew 24 is Jesus' words. So we have to be very careful of what's out there. And I think if you, would read more in the scriptures, even today, if someone says, hey, Jesus is coming, this is an indicator, and this is, and they've got a date set, really you have to write them off as a kook. Because if you look at what the scriptures say, Mark 13:32 says this, no one knows the day or the time, the angels in heaven don't know, and the Son himself doesn't know, only the Father knows. So if angels don't know and Jesus doesn't know, but only God the Father knows, who are we to predict when that time will come? Folks, that's why it's important to read the scriptures and understand there is no specific date of when he's going to return. He will return. It's going to happen. But as for us knowing, I'm sorry, we're not allowed that information. So earlier I mentioned, about the end times, Daniel chapter 2, and understanding Nebuchadnezzar's dream, and the third thing, the season that Jesus talked about. Let's go over that first one. When it comes to the end times, we understand that the end times is from Jesus' ascension to today. That's considered the end times. Jesus had these warnings about some things that would happen. Like if you're reading chapter 24, he talks about the temple being destroyed. And he was being ridiculed by that because a lot of the Pharisees were like, how long it took to build this temple. And my wife and I were with some church members in Israel at the Temple Mount, and if you look at that Temple Mount, it's humongous, and it's in awe because these stones are huge. Just obviously the engineering and construction that it took to build that place was an enormous task. And here Jesus at the time was saying, hey, all that stuff, this temple, it's all going to be destroyed. So they were kind of mocking him, but sure enough, in 90 AD or 70 AD, the Romans came in and they did destroy the temple. There's kind of some debate on how it happened, but it really doesn't matter. Some say it was an accident because these Roman soldiers were drunk or whatever and burned it accidentally, and others said, hey, Rome wanted to show their power and flex their muscle and destroy this place. But either way, Jesus' prediction in Matthew 24 about the temple being destroyed actually happened. Now, why is that temple important? And what does it have to do with the end times? Well, Jesus predicted that, hey, that thing is going to get destroyed. It was in AD 70. So if you know a little bit about the temple, in the original temple that was built by Solomon was destroyed by the Babylonians. In 586 BC, It was destroyed when basically Babylon came in and ransacked and basically took a lot of the Israelites captive. And actually that's kind of where the picture of Daniel and his friends, and you read the book of Daniel, that's kind of what, that era when that happens. But in 516 BC, the temple was rebuilt, and then again it was destroyed in 70 AD. And then there's talk of a third temple. So that's very important to understand about when it connects to the end times. That third temple, it obviously, if you go to the Temple Mount today in Israel, it's not there. In fact, you'll see a mosque up there, and Muslims claiming that it was a place where Muhammad was, and they put this mosque up there. But there is no temple today, but there is talk of rebuilding one, and that's key in the end times, because there's a lot of things surrounding that temple, and it's not up right now, but there are plans to build it. So it's really important to understand that that's a kind of a signal that, hey, when there's this temple that's built, it's kind of an indicator that, hey, we're in that season. Not that we're supposed to be worried, but it's kind of like, okay, there are other things that have happened, just over the past, within the past 2,000 years since Jesus' ascension. But we're going to get to some of those issues in a moment, because we're going to cover, the birth of Israel, or the rebirth of Israel. That was, they were non-existent for about 2,000 or over 2,000 years. So, or about 2,000 years. So they were non-existent for 2,000 years. Now, they're a country again. So, but we'll get to that in a moment. So moving on to, that second issue of understanding Daniel chapter 2. I think what's important is to actually read that first, and then we can kind of break it down and give you a better understanding. Daniel chapter 2, verse 27. Daniel answered, "Your Majesty, not even the smartest person in all the world can do what you're demanding. But the God who rules from heaven can explain mysteries. And while you were sleeping, he showed you what will happen in the future. However, you must realize that these mysteries weren't explained to me because I am smarter than everyone else. Instead, it was done so that you would understand what you have seen. Your Majesty, what you saw standing in front of you was a huge and terrifying statue. Shining brightly, its head was made of gold. Its chest and arms were silver. And from its waist down to its knees, it was bronze. From there to its ankles, it was iron. And its feet were a mixture of iron and clay. As you watched, a stone was cut from a mountain, but not by human hands. The stone struck the feet, completely shattering the iron and clay. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were crushed and blown away without a trace, like husks of wheat at threshing time. But the stone became a tremendous mountain that covered the entire earth. That was the dream. And now I'll tell you what it means. Your Majesty, you are the greatest of kings, and God has highly honored you with power over all humans, animals, and birds. You are the head of gold. After you are gone, another kingdom will rule, but it won't be as strong. Then it will be followed by a kingdom of bronze that will rule the whole world. Next, a kingdom of iron will come to power, crushing and shattering everything. The fourth kingdom will be divided. It will be both strong and brittle, just as you saw that the feet and toes were a mixture of iron and clay. This kingdom will be the result of marriage between kingdoms, but it will crumble just as iron and clay don't stick together. So here we have the actual dream itself, which he told. He didn't. No one told him what this dream was. This was something that Daniel was saying. Hey, just remember, it was the God of Israel that's giving me your dream or understanding of your dream and the interpretation of it. And Nebuchadnezzar was very impressed with this and actually realized that, wow, the God that you serve is actually dominant over any of the little gods that I believe in. So Nebuchadnezzar actually, kind of woke up spiritually that, wow, this is somebody who follows the true God, and that's the God of Israel. So onto this dream. What I'm going to do is I'm putting up this picture of this statue that Daniel's describing in this dream. Now, if you look at this statue, he explained that the head of gold was Babylon. And if you understand Babylon, yes, they were a world ruler at one time. Of course, before Babylon was the Assyrians, but they weren't that big. I mean, they were pretty, tactically and strategically a pretty good empire, but they were never as great as Babylon. Babylon had world reach. So Babylon ruled between 605 and 539 BC, as it states there. And of course, it was Nebuchadnezzar who, oversaw that empire. The following empires after that, which were described in this dream, the arms and chest of silver, is Persia. If you know a little bit about Darius and Cyrus, they're actually figures that were involved in Persia, and of course that time period between 539 and 332, and just it was kind of amazing that transition. If you're reading the scriptures, in that transition, Belshazzar, which is I believe is either the son of Nebuchadnezzar or the grandson. He's at this party, calls Daniel in, and this hand appears and writes on the wall, and the king at the time, Belshazzar, is freaking out, like, what is that? And so he calls Daniel in to interpret it, and Daniel tells him, hey, your time is up. The writing on the wall, many tekel, is explaining that your kingdom is over. And sure enough, it was like either that evening or the next day, Persia came in and took over the Babylonian Empire. So this is what we're getting out of the Bible, correlating with world history. Pretty amazing stuff. So the obviously the next empire between 332 and 168. That is Alexander the Great. If you've ever studied history about how he conquered so much of the world and died at the age of 33, this was a young, strong ruler of an empire. It was huge, and he had an interesting way of taking over, other kingdoms. He would basically have them pay tribute to him and be part of his kingdom. If not that, he would, kill them. So, and that was a kind of a typical way of a world ruler, be subject to me or I eliminate you. But Alexander the Great was very masterful at that. And so he did rule at that time. And then looking at the kingdom after Greece or after Alexander the Great, Rome, evolved, and Rome, obviously 168 to 8476, and that Roman Empire covered the time of Jesus. So it's interesting what had happened and unfolded in Rome. There's a lot of history and a lot of data, but it's involved also plugged into this dream. So where are we at today? Today from 476, the end of Rome, to this feat of iron and mixture of clay. That time period of Rome, is 476 is when it was basically the Western Roman Empire came to an end, and there was actually a larger Roman Empire that lasted even longer, and then kind of fizzled out. So it's important to understand that towards near the end times, it speaks of a mixture of empires or kingdoms, and it also correlates with what has happened in Israel. Of course, after 70 AD, the destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple, the Jewish nation going into hiding. There was no nation of Israel up until 1948. And interesting enough is in 1948, when the Jewish nation was rebirthed, basically became a nation again, which I don't believe there's any other nations in the world that's happened to, where they disappear off of the world scene for over 2,000 years, or for 2,000 years, and then reappear. But this is what was predicted in the scriptures, and it actually happened in 1948. What also happened soon after 1948, a lot of people don't catch on to, is that the European nation began. And what do I mean by the European nation? Well, there were these nations that started basically unifying. And today, so these nations started unifying, and of course, what we have today with the Eurodollar and about 27 European nations unifying to have, one money, basically almost like one country, except of course you maybe have heard of Brexit, which is the British didn't want any part of it anymore, so they're on their way out. But still, we still see, just as what was described in the scriptures, a mixture of empires coming together, mixture of kingdoms, and that's happening. It's already started, So after what had happened in 1948 with Israel becoming a nation again, soon after these nations start forming and unifying. Of course, the United States is not part of that. And it's just really key to understand what's going on in that part of the world and how it correlates with what the scriptures say, especially specifically in Daniel chapter 2, specifically this dream. So moving on to number 3, the issue of number 3 was Jesus said, understand that there is a season, that things are going to happen before his return. So I just explained that, we know in Daniel chapter 2 that, the description of this statue has come to the point of a mixture of nations. So obviously we're kind of getting close. Not to be an alarmist, but, it's kind of interesting to see how what's playing out in the world is actually what the Bible already predicted. So what I'm going to put up on the screen there is basically a time clock. And this time clock gives you an idea of what's happened, to get to this point of this season that Jesus talks about. So, it's Earth's biblical time clock. If you could, if you look at that time clock, you can see all of these events that have occurred, from the time of creation. Now, from the time of creation, and then we have, Noah's flood, the Tower of Babel, and then so on, and if you can see, and I don't know if that's correct on my Rome ending, because I think on the other slide I had 497. But either way, we know that Rome had ended. And then Israel, of course, renewed as a nation in 1948. Look at where we're at. I call it the 11th hour. From the time period of 1948 to the end of the world, we're in that era. It could happen. I don't like to say, oh, Jesus could come one day. No. A lot of people have that bad habit of saying, Jesus could come today. Jesus could, and it's like, hey, slow down there. Certain things have to occur before Jesus' return. That's what the Bible says. So those of you that are out there that like to say that Jesus could come today, I don't think you understand that that's not really applying to the end times. If you're saying, Jesus could come today, I think that more applies to you, or someone's death. Yes, you could meet Jesus as soon as you die and pass on from this earth. But as for Jesus returning, there are certain things that are going to occur, prior to Jesus' return. So, it's just important to understand that. A lot of people kind of get in a spiritual panic, so to say, and, think Jesus right now, and it's like, hold on, things, biblically have to happen before that takes place. So don't get caught up in that. I'm just kind of trying to help you out here. So this time clock, gives you an idea. And some of these dates, some of you may be wondering, well, where did you get these dates? You just kind of pull them out of the air. Actually, in one of the other episodes, I talked about the pre-Nicene documents. There are like over 10,000 of them, where these ancient Christian writers wrote about the church, wrote about things basically that were important, that applied to godly living and the church. Well, it's interesting because some of those writers actually had documented the time frame, and now we're talking, over 2,000 years ago, not our writings, their writings, and they're looking back at historically. Like right now, it's 2020. It's December 2020, and I'm giving you a report of, hey, these are things that have happened from Jesus' time to now. Well, in that time period of these ante-Nicene or pre-Nicene documents, they were, giving a report of, hey, this is from the time of creation to this point, in time before the world ends, so to say. These guys were talking about how, they actually had dates. That's something that you don't see a lot of Christians talk about today, where they have actually time frames that this is the time frame of when this particular thing happened. I think it's sometimes suppressed, in Christian teaching. Like Noah's flood, I have it there, 2452 BC. That kind of gives you an idea that, hey, this is a date, and then from this time period forward, the Tower of Babel, and then gives you a history. And it actually, some of that history can correlate with secular writing. Some of the secular writing out there, they can say, yeah, that actually happened. How do we know the Apostle Paul was real back then? Well, if you look at some of the secular writers of the day, they would point out, yeah, there's this group of Christians, and there's this guy by the name of the Apostle Paul who leads them. So, there's correlation between, the secular writing and, what we know is, what had happened scripturally. So this clock, what we're talking about here, these are events that have already happened. My Rome Falls date might be off a little bit, but these are things that have happened. So now we're in this season of, Jesus' return. So what about this season? Over the past 2,000 years, there have been many countries that set out in conquest of the world. If you look at what Napoleon did, or some of the, basically the kings and queens of England or France or Spain, that at one time, each one of these empires wanted to try and rule the world. That's why they were fighting with each other, trying to take territory. So a lot has happened in 2,000 years. But in that 2,000 years, this is something not to miss, is that yes, governments were fighting and trying to take over as a world empire, so to say. But during the same time, the gospel was spreading throughout the world. In other words, people were telling others about Jesus, just as what Jesus had commanded his disciples to do. Go out and make disciples. Tell others about Christ. This was happening over these past 2,000 years. So yes, as there were empires trying to expand, at the same time the gospel was being spread. And I believe it correlates. I believe that's just kind of the way it was going to work out. But, where are we today? Most of the world, most of the known world has been explored already, or, is under rule of, certain countries. Well, we're at a point now where it's still important to get the gospel out there, especially to your communities. And I think the point of all of this, where globally reached, and that globalism that I talked about earlier, and how does it relate to the end times? Well, we're kind of at a point now where, we can, as I'm talking to you now, I know that I have family in Mexico City and family in the Philippines that are hearing me now. It's a global outreach. I can talk to people, a lot easier than I could if it was a couple hundred years ago. So the methods now have changed to reach people for Christ. And what's important is no matter what's going on in the world, whether it's peace or chaos or war or whatever's going on, are you as a Christian reaching out to the world around you to tell others about Christ? That's more important than being worried about what's going on globally. So it's very important that you understand that, are you a worker that is pleasing God? In other words, are you someone that says they're a Christ follower and is actually, involved in the ministry to either teach others about Christ or being discipled yourself, one or the other, so that you're prepared for the Lord's return? I think that's more important, and what the scriptures are saying is more important than you worrying about, what's going on in the world, as well as wondering when it's going to end. So keep that in mind. It's important. Jesus said in Matthew 24, 32 through 33, I'm going to read that with you. It says, "Learn a lesson from a fig tree. When its branches sprout and start putting out leaves, you know that summer is near. So when you see all these things happening, you will know that the time has almost come." Jesus was talking about understanding the season before his return. So, understanding that, just as in this passage, kind of forecasting, hey, this fig tree, obviously, it's starting to, its branches are starting to sprout leaves. Maybe that's springtime, and then we know summer is coming. He's explaining it in a way that, hey, understanding what Jesus is saying here is that understand the season, that there are these things that are going to happen, but stop worrying. That time is going to come. Many in the first century, soon after Jesus had ascended, they thought his return would be sooner. And I think that a lot of times that's what spurs people to get into this hyper spiritual panic and say, "Oh, the time has come. Jesus is returning," and not realizing that Jesus said, just make sure you're prepared and keeping busy, but at the same time not worrying about that. So even these first century Christians that thought they would be raptured or they would go to be with the Lord, and it didn't happen, the same attitude has to be carried throughout time. Here we are over 2,000 years later. We have to understand that, hey, this is all of the end time, and that there are things happening that are indicators that, yes, Jesus' return is becoming closer. But that's not important. What's more important is, are you busy? Are you worshiping the Lord? Are you seeking him? Are you trying to reach out to others, with the gospel? That's more important than, trying to be holier than thou, or Mr. Important or Mrs. Important, because you figure out a day and when Jesus is going to return. Put all that aside. Understand that the gospel needs to be, pushed out there, because this is what Jesus commanded you to do. This is what is expected of you as a Christian or as a Christ follower. One of the things that's really important to understand about globalization is there's two ways you can look at it. Globalization in a free market is actually not so bad. Why? Because marketing, your goods and services, that can be like purchased online cheaper, in another part of the world. That's actually pretty good for the free market. But globalization, when it comes to control and basically unified countries that are trying to place control on others through either military or police force, that's when it becomes a problem. But I think the biggest thing to look at is, even though a lot of that chaos may be going on, let's say that, we get to a point where that is happening, where the government through either Unified Nations or the government that you're under is trying to control your life through torture and killing and manipulation, will you still stand for Christ? I think that's the bigger question here. That leads to another issue, is the rapture. Many know about this rapture because of what it says in Thessalonians, and how there will be this time that we will meet up in the air. Christians, the followers of Christ, will meet up in the air with Jesus. Now that is going to happen. That is a for sure guaranteed event. It's going to happen. Now the problem though is there's a debate in the Christian culture on when that's going to happen. There's a group of Christians that believe, hey, it's going to happen before this great tribulation, before these problems and the Antichrist and the world chaos and wars are going to happen. They believe that rapture will happen before the tribulation period. That's, talked about in the scriptures. They believe, well, we're loved so much as Christians that, God wouldn't put us through that. But that really doesn't make any sense, because if you look at what's happened through time, even just look at the Apostle Paul or Peter or some of these Christians. If you've ever read the book, the Fox's Book of Martyrs, where it talks about these individual Christians and their testimonies or people's accounts of how they were tortured and killed for Christ and martyred. Why is it so different? Why are we so different from what happened to them? What happens if your pre-tribulation beliefs are wrong? There are 3 belief systems out there regarding this rapture. Some believe pre-tribulation, some believe mid-tribulation, and others believe post, after the tribulation. Now the tribulation is a very difficult period where there's going to be some killing and torturing and agonizing and martyrdom. But these 3 theories, all different, but have actually some pretty good backing when it comes to scriptural, thought, ideas, but it's all theory. The pre-trib people can't say the post-trib people are wrong, or the mid-trib people. So be very careful of those kind of dogmatic beliefs, because I think that would probably count against you if you're wrong as somebody who believes in the pre-tribulation. What if it happens during, the tribulation period and you're tortured for Christ? That is going to be your testing. Will you give up your faith at the time and take the mark of the beast, as it talks about in the scriptures? But that's something between you and the Lord. I don't know how strong your faith is in the Lord. I don't know maturity-wise where you're at. But I just say be very careful of, these staunch beliefs in theories. Now, there's, fact. We know that, like, the Noah event was a fact. It happened. We know that Israel became a nation and it was predicted. That's a fact. Jesus' return is a fact. But believing in pre-tribulation, mid-tribulation, or post-tribulation, that's not a fact. That's a theory. So be very careful of what you believe, because it could affect you later. You may easily give up your faith if it turns out it's a post-tribulation rapture and you're stuck right in the middle of a mess. But take heart. God loves you. Jesus loves you. And are you, doing the work of the Lord? That's what's most important. So it's important not to get distracted or caught up in, the Christian cultural hype when it comes to the discussion of the end times. Because many have ridiculously and prematurely tried to predict the return of Christ or the rapture, or the end of the world. It's all ridiculous. It's important not to focus on that. Like I said earlier, it's important that you focus on, what God has set before you, which is His command to become a disciple and disciple others. That's what's important. I appreciate you viewing our Bible study today. If you would like to encourage others, feel free to share this video as well as hit that like button. So stay encouraged, because Jesus is faithful and He's watching over you. God bless you, and we'll see you at the next video.